She wasn't supposed to understand them. The two guards stood near the service entrance of the Meridian Hotel, speaking low and fast in Russian, the way men speak when they're certain no one around them can follow. Emily Carter had been clearing glasses from a cart nearby, invisible in her black uniform, and rubber-soled shoes, invisible the way a waitress always is. But she understood every word. The device was already in the car, the black sedan parked just beyond the revolving doors, and the man walking toward it. Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire. Everyone in the room had been watching all night, had less than 3 minutes to live. Emily Carter had learned Russian in a classroom that smelled like old carpet and cheap coffee on the 4th floor of a state university she could no longer afford. She had been good at it, better than good, her professor had told her once, with the kind of quiet certainty that made the compliment stick. But that was 2 years ago, before her mother's diagnosis, before the medical bills started arriving in envelopes that felt heavier each month, before she had to choose between tuition and keeping the lights on. She chose the lights. She always chose the lights. Now she worked 3 jobs: the breakfast shift at a diner on 42nd Street, weekend cashier at a pharmacy on the West Side, and Thursday through Saturday nights here at the Meridian, one of Manhattan's older luxury hotels, where the chandeliers cost more than her yearly rent, and the guests rarely made eye contact with the staff. She didn't mind. Invisibility had its uses. You learned things when people forgot you were in the room. Tonight was the annual Whitmore Tech Gala, the kind of event that filled the hotel's grand ballroom with people who had more money than most small countries. Emily had been assigned to the East Corridor, clearing glasses, wiping surfaces, making sure the service cart stayed out of frame whenever a photographer swept through. It was straightforward work. Quiet. The kind of shift where nothing happened, and you went home with sore feet and a tip envelope that was never quite enough. She had been doing exactly that. Loading used champagne flutes onto the lower shelf of her cart near the service entrance when she heard them. 2 men in dark suits standing close to the wall just around the corner of the corridor junction. Their body language was the studied stillness of men paid to look like furniture. But they were talking. Low-clipped and fast in Russian. Most people walking past would have heard only sounds. Consonants without meaning, syllables without shape. Emily heard a sentence, then another. She straightened, slowly keeping her back to them, her hand still moving on the cart, as though nothing had changed, because nothing had. Not yet. One of them said that everything was in position. The other confirmed the car. Then the first one said the name Whitmore and a time. When he exits, that was all. That was enough. Emily's hand stopped moving. Her mind, however, did not. She understood the words individually, and she understood them together. And the picture they formed was not complicated. There was a device in the black sedan parked outside the hotel's main entrance. And Daniel Whitmore, who had been photographed arriving at this gala 2 hours ago, who had a daughter named Lily, who was 8 years old, was going to walk out those revolving doors and get into that car. She had seen Daniel Whitmore's face before, not in person, but in the way most people had. On magazine covers, on the financial news, in that profile piece last spring, where they'd photographed him at his desk, and also separately at a kitchen table, with a small girl in a yellow shirt who had his same dark eyes. His wife had died 3 years prior. He was raising Lily alone. That detail had stayed with Emily, the way certain details do not, because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. A father making his daughter breakfast. A man trying to hold 2 worlds together with the same 2 hands. She looked at the time on the small clock mounted above the service door. The gala's scheduled end was printed on the staff briefing sheet she'd been handed at the start of her shift. She had less than 3 minutes before the formal program concluded and guests began filtering toward the exit. For a moment, she didn't move. She thought about what she looked like, a 22-year-old in a black service uniform with a rubber-wheeled cart, and no credentials, no badge, no last name that meant anything in this building. She thought about what would happen if she walked up to a Billionaire's security detail and told them she'd overheard a conversation in Russian. She thought about the way people like her were looked at in rooms like this one. Not with suspicion exactly. Worse than that, with nothing. As though the words coming out of her mouth were simply background noise, like the ventilation system or the distant sound of the string quartet. She thought about Lily, 8 years old, in a yellow shirt waiting somewhere for her father to come home. Emily left the cart where it was. She walked fast, not running, not yet through the corridor toward the ballroom's main entrance, where the double doors were already opening as guests began to drift toward the lobby. The noise level rose around her, voices overlapping heels on marble, the low mechanical hum of the revolving door cycling at the front of the hotel. She moved through it, all scanning for him. She spotted Daniel Whitmore near the lobby's center, surrounded by 3 men in the same dark suits as the ones she'd heard in the corridor. He was tall, unhurried, already reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone. Someone was saying something to him, a handshake, a goodbye, the kind of extended farewell that happened between men who had just spent 2 hours discussing large sums of money. He nodded, smiled faintly, took a step toward the exit. Emily moved faster. She cut through the edge of the crowd, past a server with a tray, past a woman in a red gown who gave her a sharp look. She reached the outer edge of the security perimeter, the invisible boundary that every member of staff understood without being told, and crossed it. "Don't get in that car." Her voice came out louder than she'd intended, loud enough that the nearest guard turned instantly, his hand already moving. Daniel Whitmore looked up from his phone. The lobby in that immediate radius went briefly quiet. The guard reached her in 2 steps and took her arm. His grip was firm and practiced, the grip of someone who had done this before, removed people who didn't belong, escorted them out without scene or ceremony. He was already steering her sideways away from Whitmore toward the side corridor. Emily didn't fight him. She planted her feet and said clearly, and without raising her voice further, that she had overheard 2 of the security staff speaking in Russian near the East Service entrance. She said there was a device in the black car outside. She said she understood what she had heard. The guard looked at her the way she had expected him to look at her. His grip didn't loosen. Daniel Whitmore had not moved. The guard's name tag said Reynolds. He was broad-shouldered and efficient, and he had the particular expression of someone who had been trained to treat all unexpected variables as threats until proven otherwise. His hand stayed on Emily's arm. His eyes stayed on her face. He was not listening to what she was saying. He was assessing her, cataloging her, deciding which category she belonged to. The uniform helped him decide quickly. Service staff, East Corridor, no clearance above level 2. He began moving her toward the side hallway. Emily said it again, slower this time, each word separated and deliberate. There was a device in the black sedan outside. She had heard 2 men confirming it in Russian near the East Service entrance, less than 5 minutes ago. She spoke without panic, without tears, because she understood instinctively that panic would make her easier to dismiss. Reynolds told her in a low and practiced voice that she needed to come with him and that someone would take her statement in a moment. It was the kind of sentence designed to sound cooperative while meaning the opposite. He kept walking. She kept resisting, not violently, just with the dead weight of someone who refused to be moved until they were heard. Across the lobby, Daniel Whitmore was still standing where he had been. He hadn't resumed his conversation. He was watching. His expression gave nothing away. It rarely did from what Emily had seen of him in photographs, but he was watching, and he had not yet taken another step toward the exit. One of his other guards, taller, with a close-cut beard, leaned toward him and said something. Whitmore shook his head once, a small gesture, but it stopped the guard mid-sentence. Reynolds had Emily nearly to the hallway entrance when she made a decision. She stopped trying to explain, and instead spoke loudly, clearly in Russian, the exact phrase she had heard near the service entrance. The confirmation phrase, the one that meant the device was armed and the target was in position. She hadn't planned to use it. It felt like detonating something small, just to prove a larger fire was coming. But she had no other tools, so she used the one she had. The lobby went quiet in the way that only happens when something unexpected cuts through ambient noise. A few guests turned. Reynolds's grip tightened. But across the room, Daniel Whitmore went very still. He said one word to the guard beside him. The guard moved immediately, not toward Emily, but toward the exit, speaking into his earpiece. Whitmore crossed the lobby in a straight line, unhurried, but direct, until he was standing 2 feet from Emily. He looked at her, the way she imagined he looked at contracts, searching for the clause that changed the meaning of everything. "Say it again," he said. His voice was even unreadable. Emily said it again. The same phrase, the same inflection. She told him what it meant. She told him where she had heard it, and from whom, and when. She described the 2 men, their uniforms, their positions, the direction they'd been facing. She spoke in the same controlled tone she'd used with Reynolds, because Whitmore was clearly a man who responded to information delivered without performance. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Reynolds and said, "Pull the car. Full sweep before anyone approaches it." Reynolds's expression shifted slightly. Not doubt exactly, but the recalibration of someone who had just watched the hierarchy clarify itself. He released Emily's arm and spoke into his earpiece. The next 4 minutes were the strangest Emily had ever stood through. She remained where she was, just inside the lobby, while the gala's remaining guests continued filtering past in complete ignorance. Someone laughed at something near the coat check. A photographer was packing up equipment by the ballroom doors. The string quartet had stopped playing, and the musicians were casing their instruments. Everything looked completely normal, and underneath it, something was moving fast and quietly, the way current moves under still water. The call came through Reynolds's earpiece. Emily could not hear the words, but she could read his face, the small, involuntary tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set. He turned to Whitmore and said in a voice stripped of all earlier authority that they had found something. Magnetic mount underneath the rear axle. Disposal team was on the way. Whitmore didn't react visibly. He absorbed the information the way someone does when a thing they half believed has just been confirmed, not with surprise, but with the grim satisfaction of knowing their instincts had been right to hesitate. He looked at Emily once more, and this time the assessment in his eyes was different. Not warmer exactly, but different. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily Carter," she said. "I work the Thursday night shift here." He nodded once as though filing it. Then he turned to Reynolds and the rest of his team, and the controlled chaos of the next hour began police hotel management. The rapid and quiet evacuation of the remaining guests through the rear entrance. The arrival of a bomb disposal unit in unmarked vehicles. Emily was placed in a small conference room off the main corridor and asked to wait. A woman in a gray blazer brought her water and a form to fill out. The form had fields for her full name, her contact information, her employer, and a section at the bottom that said, "Describe in your own words what you heard." She filled it out carefully. Every detail she could remember, the exact words. The order they came in, the physical descriptions of the 2 men, the time on the clock above the service door. She wrote it all down in the neat, slightly cramped handwriting she'd had since middle school, on a form in a conference room in a hotel, where an hour ago she had been clearing champagne glasses and thinking about whether she had enough in her account to cover her mother's prescription refill on Friday. The investigation moved quickly after that, and Emily was not at the center of it. She was at the edge, which was a different thing entirely. Detectives interviewed her twice that night. An FBI agent arrived sometime after midnight and interviewed her a third time, asking the same questions in a slightly different order, the way investigators do when they're checking for inconsistency. There was none. Her account didn't change because it was what had happened. What emerged from the investigation's early hours was this: the 2 men she had heard were not part of Whitmore's permanent security team. They had been brought in as supplemental staff for the gala through a third-party contractor, their credentials apparently clean enough to pass the initial vetting. By the time anyone went looking for them, they were gone. The hotel's service entrance camera had a 40-minute gap in its footage, a gap that someone had created deliberately. Further review of the security team's communication logs revealed something worse. At least one person inside Whitmore's own detail had been in contact with an outside number in the hours before the event. The investigation was now internal as well as external, which meant the perimeter that was supposed to protect Daniel Whitmore had been compromised from inside it. That detail was not shared with Emily directly. She pieced it together from the way the questions shifted in her third interview, the way the FBI agent stopped asking about the two men and started asking about who else she might have noticed near the service entrance, who else had been in that corridor, whether she had seen anyone from Whitmore's team in that area. She answered everything she could. She had not seen anyone else. Just the two men, the cart, the clock above the door. She was released at 2:15 in the morning. A car, not a black sedan. She noticed a dark blue SUV was arranged to take her home. She sat in the back and watched the city move past the window, the streets still busy, the way Manhattan streets always are. At that hour, indifferent to everything that had nearly happened on one of its corners. Her apartment was a one-bedroom on the 5th floor of a walk-up in Astoria. She shared it with her mother, Margaret, who had been asleep when Emily left for work at 7 that evening, and was asleep now when Emily came home. The apartment was quiet and small and exactly the same as she had left it. Emily sat down at the kitchen table without turning on the overhead light and stayed there for a while in the dark, listening to the sound of the city outside. She had done the right thing. She knew that cleanly and without conflict. But knowing you've done the right thing and knowing what comes next are two separate pieces of information. And right now, she only had the first one. 2 days later, she came home from the morning diner shift to find her front door unlocked. She was certain she had locked it. She always locked it. It was a habit so ingrained it was nearly physical, the same way you check a stove burner without thinking. She stood in the hallway outside her apartment for a long moment, then pushed the door open slowly. The apartment had been searched. Not ransacked, whoever had done it was careful, almost considerate, but searched. Drawers were not quite closed to their usual position. The papers on the small desk in the corner had been stacked differently. The cabinet under the kitchen sink was a fraction more open than she ever left it. Small things, the kind of things you only noticed if you knew exactly how you'd left them. On the floor, just inside the door, as though it had been slid through the gap at the bottom, was a folded piece of plain white paper. No envelope. No name on the outside. Emily picked it up and unfolded it. 4 words printed in block letters. You heard too much. She stood in the middle of her apartment holding the note and thought with a very specific kind of dread about her mother, asleep in the next room. Margaret Carter was 56 years old, recovering from a second round of treatment, and spent most of her days within the walls of this apartment. She had not gone anywhere. She had been here the entire time, and whoever had come through this door had walked past her room. Emily folded the note back along its crease. She thought about going to the police. She thought about calling the FBI agent who had given her a card. She thought about how little either of those options would change the reality of this apartment, this building, her mother's room at the end of the hall. She had no money for a different place to stay. She had no family in the city. She had the card in her wallet and a note in her hand, and the growing understanding that she had saved a man's life and that the people who had wanted him dead were not finished. She looked at the small stack of newspapers on the kitchen table her mother liked, the physical paper bought it every morning from the bodega downstairs. The top one was 2 days old, still folded to the page it had been opened to. There was a photograph on the lower half of the page, a charity event from earlier that year. Daniel Whitmore standing with a group of donors, and beside him, half-cropped at the edge of the frame, a small girl in a yellow dress, looking at something outside the photo with complete absorption. Lily. Emily set the note down on the table next to the newspaper. She did not regret what she had done in that lobby, but now she needed to decide what to do next, because the people who had planned this were still out there. She was the only witness who could place them at the scene, and the door to her apartment had just been unlocked from the inside. She used the card. Not immediately, she sat with it for the better part of an hour, turning it over in her fingers at the kitchen table, while the apartment settled into its usual evening sounds around her. Her mother had woken up mid-afternoon, made tea, asked how the shift had gone. Emily had said fine. Margaret Carter had the particular perceptiveness of someone who had spent years reading her daughter's face, but she was also tired in the deep systemic way that treatment left a person and she had not pushed. She had gone back to her room after dinner. Emily had stayed at the table with the card and the folded note and the newspaper photograph of a small girl in a yellow dress. She called the number on the card at 9:17 in the evening. It rang twice. The FBI agent, a man named Calloway, who had interviewed her at the hotel, answered on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting contact from someone, even if not necessarily her. She told him about the apartment, the unlocked door, the displaced papers, the cabinet under the sink. She told him about the note. She read it to him word for word. "You heard too much." Calloway asked her to photograph the note and send it to the number on the card, and to not touch the door handle or the area near the entrance any further. He told her that a team would be there within the hour to process the scene. His voice was calm, in the way that professional calm is not reassuring exactly, but steady, which was what she needed. Then she set the phone down and made a different call.
She had the number because one of Whitmore's people had given it to her at the end of the second interview, along with a sentence that had sounded like a formality. At the time, Mr. Whitmore wanted you to have a direct line in case anything came up. She had put the number in her phone under the name DW and not thought about it again until now. He answered himself, which surprised her.
Emily told him what she had told Calloway, the apartment, the note, and then she told him something she had not told the FBI agent. She was going to take her mother and leave the city. She had a cousin in Pennsylvania outside Philadelphia, far enough from Manhattan that the distance would mean something. She was not asking his permission. She was not asking for anything. She was telling him because it seemed like the right thing to do to give him that information before she disappeared, since she was still technically a witness in an ongoing investigation, and disappearing without telling anyone would create a different set of problems. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Whitmore said, "Don't go anywhere tonight." His voice carried the same quality it had in the hotel lobby, not a request, but not quite a command either. The tone of someone who was already 3 steps ahead and needed you to stay in place while he closed the distance. Emily told him she wasn't sure staying was the safer option. Whitmore said that leaving without protection was not safer. He said he had spent the past 48 hours working with his security team and with federal investigators, and that the situation was further along than the news had reported. He asked her to give him until morning. He said he would have people outside her building within the hour, people he trusted personally, not through a contractor, not through a third-party firm. She looked around the apartment, the displaced papers, the cabinet that wasn't quite closed, her mother's bedroom door at the end of the hall. One night, she said, Calloway's team arrived first 2 agents who photographed the door, the note, and the interior of the apartment with the efficient quiet of people doing a job they had done many times before. They were done within 40 minutes and told Emily they would be in touch. 23 minutes after they left, 2 men sent by Whitmore arrived and parked a dark green sedan across the street. They didn't come upstairs. They didn't need to. Their presence outside the building was the most concrete thing Emily had felt since she'd walked out of that hotel conference room at 2 in the morning 2 days ago. She didn't sleep much. She sat in the chair by her bedroom window and watched the street and thought about the decision she had made in that hotel corridor the moment she had left the cart and walked toward the lobby, crossing a line she had not been able to uncross since. She did not wish she had stayed silent. But clarity about a past decision did not insulate you from the weight of its consequences, and the consequences were sitting in a folded piece of paper on her kitchen table. Whitmore arrived the following morning at 10, which she had not expected. She had anticipated a phone call, or perhaps a representative, someone in a gray blazer like the woman who had brought her water at the hotel. Instead, it was him. He came with 2 members of his security team, and he stood in her small kitchen in a charcoal jacket that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and looked around the apartment with the careful, non-judgmental attention of someone cataloging a situation rather than reacting to it. He asked to see the note. She showed it to him. He read it without touching it. He told her that the investigation had identified the source of the breach, the internal contact. The person inside his security detail who had been communicating with an outside number was a man named Gary Sutter, who had been with the team for 14 months. Sutter had been taken into federal custody that morning. The 2 men from the service entrance had been located as well. They had crossed into New Jersey the night of the gala and been picked up at a transit station in Newark 40 hours later. Both were in custody. The person behind it, Whitmore said, was a man named Victor Harlan, an investor and former business partner who had been in a legal dispute with Whitmore's company for the better part of 2 years. A dispute over intellectual property, over money, over the kind of long-accrued bitterness that sometimes curdled into something more dangerous than either party had originally intended. Harlan had hired the network. He had funded it. He had not expected it to fail, and he had certainly not anticipated a 22-year-old waitress with a half-finished Russian language degree standing at exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment. Victor Harlan had been arrested the previous evening. Emily absorbed all of this at her kitchen table, her hands flat on the surface in front of her. The structure of the thing was now visible. She could see the shape of it, the sequence of decisions that had led from a boardroom dispute to a magnetic device under a car axle to a note slid under her door. It was not abstract any longer. It had names and faces and a timeline, and it was apparently over. She said, "So it's done." Whitmore said it was largely done. There would be federal proceedings. She would be required to give formal testimony, a deposition at minimum, possibly a court appearance, depending on how the case developed. Her account of what she had heard at the service entrance was central to establishing the timeline and placing the 2 men at the scene. A federal prosecutor would be in touch within the week. Emily nodded. The testimony did not frighten her the way it might have a week ago. Something had shifted, not confidence exactly, but the knowledge that she had already done the hardest part. She had spoken in a hotel lobby when no one believed her. A deposition room would be quieter than that. Whitmore's team relocated Emily and her mother that same afternoon. A secured residence on the Upper East Side, a furnished apartment in a building with a doorman and cameras and no unlocked doors. Margaret Carter, who had finally been told a version of what had happened, edited for the parts most likely to frighten her, looked around the new apartment with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had woken up in a different story than the one they'd gone to sleep in. She sat down on the couch and said in her quiet and practical way that the light in here was better than in Astoria. Emily laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 4 days. The formal testimony came 6 weeks later. Emily sat across a table from a federal prosecutor and 2 defense attorneys and gave her account in the same way she had given it 3 times at the hotel, clearly, without embellishment, with every detail she could accurately recall and none that she could not. The defense attorneys asked their questions. She answered them. It lasted 4 hours. When it was over, she walked out of the federal building onto a Manhattan street and stood in the cold air for a moment, looking at the city around her, before hailing a cab back to the Upper East Side. The apartment was temporary, she knew that. The situation would resolve, the immediate threat was gone, and her life would need to find its new shape without the scaffolding of a crisis holding it up. She had already begun thinking about what that shape might look like. A week after the testimony, she met with Whitmore again. Not in her apartment this time, in his offices on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that made Manhattan look like a diagram of itself. He offered her coffee. She took it. He told her that he had looked into her background, not intrusively, he said, but enough to understand what she had left behind when she'd withdrawn from university. He told her that if she wanted to return to school, he would ensure she could do so without the financial circumstances that had interrupted her the first time. He was not offering charity, he said. He was offering a correction, the kind that sometimes came when a person's path had been bent by forces outside their control, and someone with resources happened to owe them something significant. Emily looked at him across the table. She thought about the diner on 42nd Street, the pharmacy on the West Side, the Thursday night shifts at the Meridian, with the cart and the champagne flutes and the invisibility that service work required. She thought about her Russian professor, who had told her she was better than good. She thought about the 4-word note on her kitchen table, and the 2 men in the corridor, and the decision she had made in the space of a few seconds that had led her to this window, this city, this particular version of what came next. "I'll think about it," she said. Whitmore nodded. He seemed to expect that answer or something like it. He did not push. 3 days later, a small envelope arrived at the apartment. No return address, but the handwriting on the front was the careful block print of a child, her name spelled correctly, which somehow made it more affecting than if it had been misspelled. Inside was a single sheet of white paper, folded once. On it, in crayon blue, with some yellow along the edges, where another color had bled in, was a drawing. A figure with dark hair standing next to a taller figure. The sun in the corner, the way children always draw it, and at the bottom of the page, in the same careful print as the envelope, a sentence in green crayon. "Thank you for saving my dad." Whitmore had told Lily something, not all of it. Not the parts a child of 8 didn't need to carry, but enough. Enough for her to understand that a woman named Emily had been there when it mattered, and that her father had come home because of it. Emily sat with the drawing for a long time. She set it on the table next to her coffee and looked at it without speaking, without moving, while the morning light came through the windows of an apartment that was not hers, but felt for now like enough. She did not change her mind about Whitmore's offer that morning. But she picked up her phone, found the contact she had saved as DW, and sent a single message, "I'll take it." She set the phone down and looked at the drawing again. A figure with dark hair, a taller figure beside it. The sun in the corner, exactly where the sun always goes, when a child draws the world the way they want it to be, bright, simple, and whole.